rate is made if you find money, where is it supposed to go and where does it actually go?
We'll get to those kind of topics in a minute. Most of it goes back to, if it's seized, it goes into the court, and then once the court's done with it, then if the person's convicted and if it's turned, then it comes back to our drug enforcement, which we can utilize those resources for that going forward. But again, sometimes it becomes very problematic. Far too often in my county, we end up turning the money back over to the offenders, which is inappropriate in my book. But what we're going to do is I'm going to touch on the impacts or what's going on with AB109 first, and we're going to pass it around, and then we're going to deal with several different topics as we go forward. For anybody that doesn't know, 20 years ago, the state of California was sued in federal court, and that lawsuit said that they did not have proper medical and psychological coverage for inmates in the state prisons, and that they had to reduce their population and increase the level of service. The state of California for 20 years did nothing about it, believing that they could prevail in court and that they would be allowed to maintain the amount of inmate and population that they had. They had addressed some of the medical issues, but they had not addressed the population ratios. Then about 4 years ago, the court finally had enough of California. We did not prevail in court, and the 3-judge panel that was in charge of this Coleman-Pilata case said, if you do not reduce your population in your prisons, we will force it and do it ourselves and force you to release 42,000 inmates back out into your state. Because of that impetus, we were then forced, in an agreement between many of the sheriffs, to look at alternatives. How were they going to reduce? And part of that was that they were going to reduce the low-level offenders, primarily drug offenders and others, non-violent, non-sex, non-repeat offenders, release them from the state prisons back to our communities. This was called AB109. That was in 2011. I was all part of the negotiations. I fought against it as far as a sheriff from a small county like ours. I could see that the impacts that AB109 was going to affect, because it basically changes our county jails from short-term facilities into prisons. Because we were now going to be saddled with inmates that were going to, originally told us, anything less, 3 years or less would be housed in your county jails. Unfortunately, what was not explained to us was that if they were consecutive sentencing, and if there were enhancements, that did not count towards those 3 years. So now, in several jail facilities in the state of California, we have inmates sentenced to 47 years in county jails. County jails were never built nor designed to house long-term inmates. Under state law, you would do a year in county jails maximum. My average stay prior to AB109 was 45 days. Post AB109, we're now tracking at 160 plus days. And that will change as we get more and more long-term in custody. It changed the absolute dynamics that we are now facing as a county. The bonus that came to county sheriffs was that critical funding that we had often competed for and often fought for legislatively was now solidified in legislation and is now guaranteed under the AB109, so that rural sheriff's funding of $500,000 that we would constantly compete against and for. And when I first came as sheriff in 2002 and 2003, we lost that funding, and because of a budget battle between the Democrats and the Republicans that year in Sacramento. Well, that's now been solidified and now stabilized. Other cops money, what we call CalMet money, to fight methamphetamine, is now all stabilized and it's been solidified, so that we're no longer having to worry about the California budgets losing or having it taken away from us. That was the trade-off for the agreement of dealing with the AB109. There was also additional AB109 funding that was supposed to come to each county. Unfortunately, that dollar was very insignificant, and I, as a sheriff, would, for the last several years, every time I get the opportunity to talk to the governor, our lobbyists would roll their eyes when I started talking because I was constantly telling them about the impacts negatively towards Delaware County, because unfortunately, I had a very successful program in my jail dealing with these low-level offenders for state parole, and it brought in over $700,000 to Delaware County. When we lost, when the AB109 shoveled those low-level offenders out of state prisons and put them back into the county, that program went away, and we lost the revenue that program generated for us. And in return, what my county jail saw was about $85,000 in revenue, and we lost $700,000. So for AB109, the impacts that it caused to Delaware County was that we had to reduce the level of our jail capacity down to 100 inmates now, even though we have a 150-bed facility, we only hold about 100 inmates. Traditionally, we'd average about 120 prior to AB109. And now we also had to deal with how do we implement the programs, the recidivism, to reduce recidivism, how do we implement the programs with the limited funding that we did get into Delaware County. Luckily enough, this last year, because of the complaints that I made to the governor's office and the constant badgering that they had to listen to me, as well as our county representatives, this year coming up, we went from $600,000 to $1.2 million. So they listened to the problems that small counties have had. They listened specifically to Delaware County and what our situation is. So for the upcoming year, we have some additional funding that is specifically for Delaware County, and that's an additional $300,000. After that, we'll see about $900,000 going forward every year to deal with the AB109 and how we can help to provide programs. Unfortunately for Delaware County, at the same time when AB109 was sent our way, we were going through a transition on our probation, and we were going through some turmoil in our DA's office. Two vital components for the success of the realignment, because the probation department is in charge of providing the programming and to try to deal with the recidivism problem. And the DA's office, of course, is a critical component in prosecuting individuals if they do commit new crimes. So we are now dealing with that issue in Delaware County because we're 2 years behind. We now have a very good, I believe, probation chief and a new DA. Having those components in place, along with the fact that I've been dealing with this from the beginning, having the experience and the knowledge I have dealing with AB109, I hope we have the components in place to begin to utilize the resources to provide the programming. We've put in programming into our jail, new education programming. We've put in, of course, family counseling programming. We've put in other drug and alcohol programs to try to deal with these issues that we're going. And we are also competing for this next year. There's $500 million in bond that will go towards jail modifications to deal with AB109. And we sought some money last time, and we did not get it. This time we are seeking it again. It'll be, if we are successful, a $10 million project, remod to our jail facility that specifically addresses safety, security, and providing the necessary needed program space so that we can fulfill the obligations that we are now mandated to do under the AB109 and under realignment. So that's what we're dealing with in Delaware County. So the impacts were significant, but fortunately enough, moving forward, we have seen an increase in revenue coming to Delaware County so that we can meet some more of those challenges, because prior to this, the funding was not significant enough to allow us to really begin to take a hold of what, to meet the responsibilities that we were supposed to do with reducing recidivism. Now I'll pass it off to Jon Lopey, and he can talk about the impacts that Siskiyou County is facing and how they're dealing with AB109. Part of the AB109 is that each county has what we call a community partnership. And that community partnership is that we all have our different shareholders for the DA's office, probation, public defender's office, social services, mental health, all are part of this CCP program, so that we help to design how our particular program, because there's no mandate, there's no dictate on how it's done. Every county forms its own process on how it's going to deal with the AB109 realignment and recidivism.
Thanks, Steve. In Siskiyou County, I can tell you that it's similar to what's happening in other counties. You know, this realignment program was a real challenge for all sheriffs because it did present unique problems to us. I'll tell you, the biggest impact in Siskiyou County is we have 107 beds in our jail maximum. We have 104 plus 3 medical beds. And not one misdemeanor, you know, will stay in the jail for any length of time. It's all felons in our jail. Now, that is a challenge. We do have a very workable community corrections partnership that is required by realignment, and that's where the sheriff and the behavioral health services and the judge and the district attorney and the public defender and a bunch of other stakeholders, you know, especially probation, you know, work together to allocate funds provided by the state. Now, I worked for Jerry Brown twice because, like Mike Poindexter, I worked for a police department back in the 77, then I joined the highway patrol. So I worked for a police department, I worked for the highway patrol for almost 33 years. And I worked for Jerry Brown back in the 70s when he was the governor then. And he's a little older and a little wiser, but I must say, I'm not going to get into politics, but he has provided the counties the funding mechanisms that help us to design programs to deal with this influx of non-violent, non-sex offender, non-serious offenders that we're getting into our counties. It's a huge problem. And imagine those jails that were built for maybe 60% misdemeanors, you know, your bar brawlers, your drunk drivers, your petty thieves, and now it's all felons, you know, serious offenders. We have to decide what felon to release. Well, do we, you know, release the domestic violence offender or the armed robber, you know, those kind of things. But, you know, we work together, you know, to make those decisions, and we have a risk assessment tool. And, you know, normally We're not happy with the people that are released, but we try to release the least offensive individual out into society. Now, I think I'd just like to elaborate on the good side of realignment, is that I think the counties can do a better job than the state to help rehabilitate offenders. And I'll tell you, the way things are going right now is we cannot afford to throw everybody in the slammer and throw away the key anymore. We don't have the money. In my jail, it costs over $119 a day to house an offender. Over $119 a day. In the state prison system, it's upwards somewhere around anywhere from $35,000 to $55,000 to house an inmate on an annual basis. So I think the counties, like my county, we have a great community corrections partnership. We have a lot of synergy, and we're working on rehabilitation programs, counseling, treatment. We're working on alternate work programs. We're trying to get people educated. We're trying to give them, family enrichment. Some criminals have anger management problems, so we help them deal with their anger. So, in actuality, we are seeing some success because we are attempting to give inmates and their families, because we even have family enrichment programs, we're trying to give them more tools with which they can be more successful in society. And right now, the recidivism rate in the North State is like 70%. In my county, because of some of the programs, we're seeing anecdotal and scientific information indicate that perhaps the recidivism rate is dropping like 20 to 25, maybe 30%. Now, if that holds, that's huge. So I think the counties are doing a better job than the state did in helping transform people's lives, and I think a lot of people can be rehabilitated. Some people will never be rehabilitated, but in that way, I think the realignment program, they handed us a real challenge. But with that challenge came opportunities, and I think Dean Wilson and all these sheriffs sitting before you are the kind of sheriffs who are innovative, that will use that as an opportunity to make the best out of a precarious and maybe a bad situation. And I think in Siskiyou County, I think we're ahead of the game. We had some state people came up, and we have a day reporting center where all the inmates report. And we even have them out there picking up trash on the freeway. Hey, I'm all for getting them gainfully employed, because if you get them gainfully employed, they're not out ripping people off or doing the nefarious things. So we're doing a lot of positive things. I think that this program could ultimately be successful if we turn some of these criminals into so-called law-abiding citizens. And we're working real well with our counterparts in the other agencies. And now the big question is, in my mind, is the money we're getting enough? Probably isn't. But we're working with it. We're working with LIHCs. We're working with the inmates, and we're trying to make the best out of a difficult situation. I think that's all I have to say. I'll field questions later if you have any specific questions about Siskiyou County. But another thing I just mentioned, being in this great hall, represents all the armed forces and the sacrifices made by those servicemen and women in the past. We're doing things in my county like approximately 9% of the inmates are veterans. So we're trying to help the veterans out because some of them are suffering from PTSD. We even have equine therapy, which is horse therapy for some inmates. Believe it or not, horses are great animals, and they're helping with this therapeutic process. And the reason I endorsed it is because horses have been used for wounded veterans very successfully in disabled kids. So there are a lot of good programs out there. A lot of us are using the similar or same programs, and I think that the future may look bright if we keep up the good work in our respective counties. Thank you. Mike's got some extra horses.
One of the issues that AB109 that we've seen in Delaware County, of course, is petty theft and the homeless, because many of these coming out